Cindy had been Luna of Silverfang for 2 years. 2 years of quiet service. 2 years of healing wounds the kingdom's warriors were too proud to admit hurt. 2 years of standing beside a man whose presence filled every room like thunder, and telling herself that the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her was real. 2 years of loving Alpha King Jameson. The entire kingdom had called their bond a miracle, whispered it like a prayer, an omega, chosen for the most powerful alpha alive. The council had stood in stunned silence the night the bond revealed itself, that invisible thread of fate pulling taut between 2 wolves who had no business belonging to each other. Noble daughters had wept. Pack lords had questioned the moon's judgment aloud. Cindy had ignored every word, because Jameson had chosen her, or so she believed. The morning always started the same way, in the Alpha's palace. She rose before him. That was something most people didn't know, that behind the great stone walls of Silverfang's throne keep, behind the locked doors and the guards who stood silent as carved wood, the Luna of the kingdom woke before dawn and sat by the narrow window with her knees pulled to her chest, watching the dark sky soften, not out of restlessness, out of a quiet, private ritual she had carried since childhood, the belief that if you watched the moment darkness gave way to light, you could feel the moon's presence lingering just a little longer, like a hand withdrawing slowly, reluctant to let go. It was an Omega's way of praying. Jameson never understood it, but he never mocked it either. Once, in the first weeks after their bond formed, she had woken to find him sitting beside her in the dark, not speaking, not asking, just there, his shoulder warm against hers, his golden hair loose and untamed, his expression stripped of the iron composure he wore like armor in every council hall and public gathering. Just a man, sitting with a woman in the dark, watching the sky. She had loved him terribly in that moment. She still did. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now, let's dive in. Cindy dressed slowly that morning, choosing the deep blue wrap that Jameson had once said matched the color of night water, a rare compliment from a man who spoke in silences more than sentences. She braided her dark hair herself, the way she always had, fingers moving with the practiced calm of someone who had learned long ago that small, certain things could anchor you when larger ones threatened to drift. The pack healers had requested moonbark herbs for the East Wing's recovery rooms. 3 soldiers had returned from border patrol with silver-laced wounds, infections, stubborn and slow, the kind that required steady hands and careful mixing. She had prepared the bundles herself the night before, wrapped in linen, tied with twine. It was not the work of a Luna, most would say. Cindy disagreed. Healing was the most powerful thing she knew how to do. Not the dramatic, battlefield kind, not the kind the pack songs celebrated, but the quiet, room-by-room kind. The kind that required you to sit with someone's pain long enough to understand it before you tried to fix it. Her wolf had always been built for exactly that. She lifted the bundle from the table, tucked it against her arm, and stepped into the corridor. The palace was alive with low, hurried energy that morning. Something was happening. She could feel it the way she always felt. Shifts in the pack's emotional current, like pressure behind the sternum, like the air thickening before a storm. Servants moved faster than usual. Guards near the east corridor spoke in murmurs that stopped the moment she passed. A council page nearly walked into her rounding a corner and apologized without making eye contact. She noticed. She always noticed. Jameson had been distant for nearly 2 weeks. Not cruel, never cruel, but absent in the way that a fire goes absent when it burns low. Still warm if you pressed close enough, but diminished, careful, as if he were measuring the space between them deliberately, making sure not to close it. She had told herself it was council pressure. The Northern Claw pack had been restless, alliance talks had stalled twice, and Jameson wore the weight of Silverfang's politics the way other men wore old injuries quietly, without complaint, but visible in the set of his jaw and the hours he spent alone in the war room after midnight. She had told herself it would pass. She turned toward the council corridor. the healing bundle warm against her arm, her footsteps soft on the stone. The doors to the chamber were shut, but not latched. She heard voices before she meant to, and then she heard his. Jameson's voice low, controlled, unmistakably. Final slipped through the gap like a blade finding its edge. "We cannot keep pretending the bond is real." Cindy stopped. The bundle in her arms suddenly weighed nothing. Her heart suddenly weighed everything. She stood outside the door in the torchlit corridor, perfectly still, while the world she had built around 2 years of quiet belief began to crack, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the precise, irreversible way that stone cracks when the cold finally reaches its center. And she listened. She should have walked away. That was the thought that came to her later, much later, when the night had swallowed everything, and she was sitting alone in her chamber, trying to reassemble herself from the inside out. She should have heard those first words, recognized the closed door for what it was, and walked away. But her feet did not move, and so she listened. The council elder's voice was the first she recognized. Lord Aldrich, ancient, dry, deliberate. A man who had served 3 Alpha Kings and outlasted every one of them through sheer, relentless patience. He spoke the way old stone looked, unmovable, indifferent to whatever grew against it. "The Northern Claw Pack will not wait past the next full moon," Aldrich said. "Their Alpha has extended this courtesy long enough. A formal answer must be given." "I understand that," Jameson's voice. Still low, still controlled, but carrying something underneath it, not reluctance exactly. More like a man who had already made a decision he didn't entirely like, and was now simply waiting for the conversation to catch up to him. "Then you also understand that the current arrangement must be dissolved before any formal alliance can be sealed." A pause, the sound of something parchment perhaps, or a chair shifting. "Princess Mara's pact demands a clean bond. No shadows, no legal complications. The throne cannot enter a new mating agreement while the old one still stands on record." Silence. Cindy pressed her back slightly against the wall beside the door, her healing bundle forgotten in her arms, her breath measured and careful, and absolutely silent. Old one. As if their bond were an administrative entry in a ledger. As if 2 years were simply a column of figures to be corrected. Then Lord Aldrich spoke again, and the words that came out of his mouth rearranged everything. "The illusion bond worked longer than expected. I will credit the craftsman for that. But even the finest spell work has limits. It will fracture on its own within months regardless. Better to dissolve it cleanly now, on our terms, before it becomes visible to others." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Cindy had ever heard. "Illusion bon." The 2 words landed somewhere below her ribs and did not move. Illusion. She had felt it the morning it formed. That bright, sudden certainty like a thread of light drawn taut between her chest and Jameson's. She had thought it was the most honest thing she had ever experienced in her body. More honest than hunger, more honest than breath. She had built her understanding of herself around it. Illusion. A second voice entered the conversation, now younger, clipped, practical. Councilman Devrin, she thought. The one who managed military alliances and spoke about people the way soldiers spoke about terrain. Useful, obstacle, expendable. The Omega was a sensible choice at the time, Devrin said. The pack was destabilized after the late king's death. 2 rival bloodlines making claims on the throne. Morale at its lowest point in 40 years. An Omega Luna signaled peace, softness. It told the pack that the new king was not going to rule through fear alone. It worked, Aldrich agreed. Silverfang stabilized. The rival claims dissolved. The people accepted King Jameson because they accepted her first. Because they accepted her first. Cindy's fingers tightened around the linen bundle. Not in anger, not yet. Something colder. The specific numbness that arrives when a truth is too large to feel all at once, and the body simply goes quiet, waiting. She had been a strategy, not chosen. Not beloved by fate. A calculated move on a political board warm enough to seem human, powerless enough to seem safe, temporary enough to be replaced the moment something more useful came along. A placeholder with a heartbeat. Jameson. Lord Aldrich's voice again, careful now, measured in a way that suggested he was watching the young king's face. You've been quiet. Another silence. Longer this time. When Jameson finally spoke, his voice had changed. Not cold, something worse. Resigned. The voice of a man pressing down on something that wanted to rise. She doesn't deserve this. No one replied. She has served this pack with more genuine care than half the nobles in this hall. She has never asked for power or position. She has never... He stopped. The sound of movement boots on stone. The restlessness of a man containing himself. She doesn't deserve to be discarded like a tool that's finished its purpose. Cindy closed her eyes. No, Aldrich said simply. She doesn't, but the kingdom requires it. The terrible thing, the thing that would stay with her longest, was what came next. Jameson said nothing. Not one word of refusal. Not a single syllable of resistance. Only silence. And in that silence, she heard his answer more clearly than any words he might have spoken. Cindy stepped back from the door. One step, then another. Slow and deliberate. The way you moved around something fragile that you no longer had any reason to protect. She turned and walked back down the corridor. She did not run. She did not press her hand to her mouth or lean against the wall or let the tears come, and they were there. She could feel them gathered and waiting like storm pressure, patient and enormous. But something else was there too. Something she had no name for yet. It started deep in her chest, just beneath the place where the bond sat, that warm, golden thread she had trusted without question for 2 years. She could feel it now differently, feel its edges, its constructed shape, the faint, artificial hum of something built rather than born. And beneath it, beneath the lie, something else was humming back, something older, something that had apparently been there the entire time, quiet and waiting, like a fire that needed the right kind of darkness to finally show its light. Cindy walked back toward her chambers, and for the first time in 2 years, the most frightening thing in her chest was not the bond, it was whatever was waking up underneath it. Her chamber door closed behind her with a sound like a held breath releasing. Cindy set the healing bundle on the table near the window. Slowly, carefully, the way you set down something heavy when your arms have gone numb, and you are no longer entirely sure your hands are working properly. She stood there for a moment with her back to the room, her fingers still resting on the linen wrapping, and breathed. In, out. The sky beyond the glass had brightened fully now. Morning had arrived without her permission, indifferent and complete, flooding the chamber in pale silver light that made everything look colder than it was. She turned away from the window and sat on the edge of the bed, and then, for the first time since the corridor, she turned her attention inward. The bond was still there. Of course it was. It didn't know yet that she knew. It sat in her chest the way it always had, warm, insistent, faintly luminous in the way of things that carry borrowed light. A thread of gold running from somewhere behind her sternum outward, tethered to a man 2 corridors away who was currently agreeing to erase her. But now that she was looking at it, truly looking, the way her emotional sensitivity allowed her to look at things most wolves simply felt and accepted, it was different. She didn't know how she had never noticed before. Or perhaps she had noticed and called it something else. Called it the strangeness of new bonds. Called it the awkwardness of 2 people learning each other's rhythms. Called it nerves, or hope, or the particular vulnerability of loving someone more powerful than yourself. It didn't feel like moonlight. Real bonds, she had felt them in others. That warm, organic resonance when mated pairs stood close. The way the air between them seemed to breathe differently. Real bonds felt like something that had grown. Rooted, organic, like finding a tree that had been there long before you arrived. This felt assembled, precise and deliberate, each thread laid carefully against the next, beautiful in the way that constructed things were beautiful intentionally, artificially, without the particular wildness that living things carried in their grain. The illusion bond worked longer than expected. Cindy pressed her palm flat against her sternum and held it there. The flashbacks came without invitation. Jameson in the herb garden, 3 months into their bond, crouching beside her while she treated a burn on her own forearm from a tipped candle. He had taken her wrist with a gentleness completely at odds with his size and his reputation, turned it carefully toward the light, and said nothing, just held it there, examining the damage with an expression she had never seen on him in any council meeting or public ceremony. Focused, almost pained, as if her small wound was a personal offense he intended to correct. "You should have called someone," he said. "I am someone," she replied. Something had shifted in his face then. Not a smile, not quite, but the precursor to one. The moment before, she had thought about that look for weeks afterward. She remembered the night a late summer storm had rolled over Silverfang, with the particular violence of storms that arrive without warning. She had always been unsettled by thunder, not frightened. Exactly. Just rawly awake in a way she couldn't explain. Every nerve lit and restless. Jameson had found her sitting on the windowsill at 2 a.m, with her forehead against the glass. He didn't ask questions. He simply brought the blanket from the bed and draped it over her shoulders and sat on the floor beneath the window with his back against the wall, one arm resting on his knee. They stayed that way until the storm passed. He never mentioned it again. Neither did she. Was any of it real? The question arrived quietly and took up enormous space. She turned it over carefully, the way she turned over difficult things. Not roughly, not trying to force an answer, just examining it from all sides, like an object she had found and didn't yet understand. The bond had been fabricated. That was true. But the man who sat beneath the window during a storm, had the council constructed that too? Had they spelled him into patience, into the precise, unguarded softness he only ever showed in private? She didn't know, and not knowing was its own particular kind of wound. She was still pressing her palm to her chest when she felt it again. That other thing. The one she had first noticed in the corridor, the hum beneath the hum. The presence beneath the constructed warmth of the illusion bond. She focused on it carefully now, the way she focused on emotional currents in others when she was trying to understand something complex and half-hidden. It was old. Not old the way Aldrich was old, or the palace stones were old. Old the way the moon was old. Pre-language, pre-kingdom, something that existed before anyone had thought to name it. It lived beneath the false bond, like bedrock beneath shallow water. And as she sat with it, as she stopped trying to understand it and simply let herself feel it, something became very clear. The illusion bond had been built with magic, and anything built with magic had a structure, a shape, seams. And Cindy, who had spent 2 years learning to feel the precise emotional architecture of every living thing around her, could feel exactly where those seams were. She could pull them apart. She could break it herself. The realization didn't arrive with triumph. It arrived with the quiet, irreversible weight of something that, once understood, could not be unfelt. Cindy lowered her hand from her chest and sat very still in the morning light, thinking. She didn't sleep that night, or the one after. Instead, Cindy sat with the bond, the way she sat with difficult patience, quietly, without agenda, observing, before she attempted anything, letting the thing reveal itself on its own terms before she decided what to do with it. She had learned that from the old healer who raised her. Never cut before you understand what's underneath, the woman used to say, hands moving through dried herb bundles with practiced certainty. Rushing a diagnosis is just a more confident way of being wrong. So Cindy waited, and watched, and felt. On the 3rd night, she tried something small. She sat cross-legged on the chamber floor after the palace went quiet, her back straight, both palms resting open on her knees, the way she positioned herself when reading emotional currents in wounded pack members. She found the bond in her chest, that familiar, constructed warmth, and instead of simply observing it, she pressed against it, gently, the way you pressed a finger against a bruise to map its edges. The magic responded immediately. It flickered, actually flickered, like a candle touched by draught, the warmth in her chest stuttering for just a moment before steadying again. Cindy pulled back, heart beating faster. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she tried again. This time she didn't press against the bond from outside. She slipped underneath it, through the gap between the constructed magic and whatever that older, deeper thing was, and simply existed there for a moment, in the space between two kinds of power. What happened next, she was not prepared for. The moonlight coming through the window moved. Not the light itself, not the angle, but the quality of it, the texture, the weight, shifted in a way she felt against her skin before she saw it. Warmer, more present, as if the moon had turned its full attention downward and found her specifically, a narrow beam of something ancient and deliberate, pouring through the glass and settling across her upturned palms like a second skin. Cindy gasped and broke her concentration. The feeling vanished instantly. She sat in the ordinary dark of her chamber, breathing hard, staring at her hands. She had grown up being told what omegas were. Everyone had. It was simply one of those facts the kingdom carried without examining the way people carried old furniture, assuming it had always been there and therefore must belong. Omegas were gentle. Omegas were healers. Omegas served, endured, softened the harder edges of pack life through emotional attunement and quiet sacrifice. Omegas were not powerful, but Cindy sat in the dark, with moonlight still tingling in the lines of her palms, and thought about something she had never been encouraged to think about: emotional attunement. The ability to feel what others felt, grief, fear, deception, love, as clearly as physical sensation. The ability to read the invisible architecture of feeling in a room and understand it before anyone spoke a word. What was that if not extraordinary sensitivity? And sensitivity, she was beginning to understand, was simply another word for receptivity. She had always received. She had simply never understood what she was receiving from. Jameson appeared at dinner that evening for the first time in 4 days. He sat at the head of the long table as he always did, composed and correct, his golden hair pulled back, his expression carrying that particular quality of controlled attention that most people mistook for coldness. He answered the council's questions. He ate without appetite. He performed the role of king with the effortless, exhausting precision of someone who had been doing it since he was too young to have agreed to it. But 3 times during the meal, Cindy felt his gaze on the side of her face. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She could feel the texture of it, not the cold assessment he turned on political rivals, not the distant courtesy he offered pack visitors. Something more complicated. Something that moved the way guilt moved when it was trying to look like composure. After the meal, in the corridor, he slowed his pace as they passed each other. "Cindy," her name in his voice careful. "Lo, my lord." She kept walking. She heard him stop behind her, heard the pause that contained everything he wasn't saying, then the sound of his footsteps resuming in the opposite direction. She had felt, in that single moment, every conflicted thing he was carrying. She had felt it as clearly as weather. It did not soften her. The council announcement came 2 mornings later. Lord Aldrich, composed and unhurried as always, informed the assembled nobles that the engagement ceremony between Alpha King Jameson and Princess Mara of the Northern Claw Pack would take place within the fortnight. The room received this with careful diplomatic approval. Cindy stood near the back of the hall in her healer's wrap and said nothing, showed nothing, let her face do what faces do when they have been practiced into stillness. But in her chest, beneath the false warmth of the illusion bond, that older thing pulsed once, like a heartbeat answering a question. She walked back to her chamber, closed the door, and stood in the center of the room with the morning light falling across her shoulders. She had been waiting. For what? She hadn't been entirely sure. But she was done waiting now. She was not going to stand in that hall and watch herself be erased. If the bond was going to end, it would end on her terms. And whatever was waking up inside her chest was going to be hers when it did. The royal hall had not been this full in 2 years. Pack lords had arrived from every corner of Silverfang's territory, some by horse, some by wolf, all of them dressed in the formal colors of their bloodlines, filling the tiered gallery seats with a slow, deliberate pageantry that the council had clearly orchestrated. This was not a simple announcement. It was a performance, a statement of power, dressed in ceremony, designed to be witnessed and remembered and retold. Cindy understood that now in a way she wouldn't have 2 weeks ago. Everything here was designed. Every symbol, every arrangement, every carefully chosen face in the front row. The council had spent 40 years constructing the architecture of perception in this kingdom, and they were very, very good at it. She dressed carefully that morning, not in the soft, yielding blues she usually favored. She chose the deep charcoal gray, the one with the silver threading at the collar that she had worn exactly once before, the night Jameson was formally crowned, the one that made her look less like a healer and more like someone who had decided to take up space. She braided her hair back tightly, looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. Then she walked to the hall. The room quieted in the particular way rooms quieted when something unspoken moved through them. She felt it the moment she entered that invisible current of collective awareness, shifting, adjusting, recalculating. Eyes moved to her, and then away, the way eyes moved from things that made people uncomfortable. Several noble wives leaned toward their husbands. A pack lord near the eastern column murmured something behind his hand. They were expecting a specific story today. They had already written it in their heads. The displaced Omega Luna, quietly set aside, graceful in her diminishment, politely invisible. Cindy walked to her position beside Jameson and stood there. He was already at the front of the hall, composed as stone in his formal blacks, his jaw set in that way that meant he was holding himself together through pure structural will. When she took her place at his left, she felt him go very still. He didn't look at her directly, but she felt, with absolute clarity, the shift in his emotional landscape the moment she arrived. That complicated guilt she had sensed in the corridor after dinner, it was louder now, almost unbearable. The feeling of a man standing inside a decision he had already made, while some quieter part of him continued to protest it. She did not look at him either. She faced forward and waited. Lord Aldrich ascended the speaking platform with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once been interrupted in his life. The hall settled into formal silence. "Lords and ladies of Silverfang," he began, his voice carrying the practiced resonance of decades in council chambers. "We gather today at the command of the throne to bear witness to an announcement of great political significance for the future of our kingdom." He paused. Let the silence do its work. Alpha King Jameson, in his wisdom and duty to Silverfang's continued strength and stability, has entered into a formal alliance agreement with the Northern Claw Pack. In accordance with this agreement, stop. The word left Cindy's mouth quietly, not shouted, not desperate. The way you stop someone walking toward an edge, calm, certain, brooking no argument. The hall didn't erupt. It froze. Every head turned. The kind of collective stillness that happened when something so outside the expected order occurred that the room needed a full moment to process whether it had actually happened at all. Aldrich turned toward her slowly, his expression cycling through disbelief and arriving somewhere in the neighborhood of fury, held under extremely tight control. Jameson turned too. For the first time in days, he looked directly at her. And in his face she saw something she hadn't expected, not anger, not cold command, something closer to dread. The specific dread of a man watching something he had hoped to avoid walking toward him anyway. He knew. In that moment, she understood. He had known she might do something like this, had perhaps been quietly, guiltily waiting for it. "Cindy," her name from his mouth. Low. Warning. Almost pleading. She held his gaze steadily. "You said the bond wasn't real." The silence shattered, not loudly in pieces, in every direction at once. Whispers igniting across the gallery like fire catching in dry grass, the sound building from murmur to a low, urgent roar in the space of seconds. Pack lords turned to one another. Nobles gripped their armrests. Someone near the back said what loud enough to carry. The council elder's face went to stone. Jameson's jaw tightened. Something moved through his expression, pain, she thought. Genuine and unguarded. The one honest thing he had shown her in weeks. "You weren't meant to hear that," he said quietly. The room strained toward them, every ear forward. Cindy looked at him for one long, clear moment. Let herself see him fully, the golden-haired king who had sat with her in the dark during storms, who had held her burned wrist toward the light, who had chosen power over truth when the moment came, and said nothing in her defense. She smiled, not in cruelty, in sadness, the particular sadness of closing a door on something you once loved very much. "You're right," she said. Then she raised her hand and pressed it flat against her heart. "And since it isn't real," her voice was completely steady, "I'll break it first." No one moved. The hall held its breath the way the world holds its breath before lightning, that suspended, electric instant where everything is still and the air itself seems to understand that something irreversible is about to happen. Cindy kept her palm pressed flat against her chest. She found the bond the way she always found it now, immediately. Precisely the way you find a familiar object in the dark. That constructed warmth. That deliberately assembled architecture of feeling, seam by careful seam, running through her chest like a thread of borrowed gold. She had spent 3 nights learning its shape. She knew exactly where to pull. She didn't force it. That was the thing she had understood. Sitting on the chamber floor in the quiet dark, that force was the wrong instrument entirely. The bond hadn't been built through violence. It had been built through intention, through careful, magical construction, layer by deliberate layer. And so she unmade it the same way, layer by layer, with absolute, calm intention. She pressed her awareness into the first seam, felt the magic resist briefly, the way a knot resisted before it recognized that the tension holding it was gone, and then it simply came apart. A single thread of the constructed warmth unraveling, dissolving back into nothing, then the next, then the next. It took less than 10 seconds. From the outside, she suspected it looked like nothing at all, a woman standing still with her hand over her heart while an entire hall of nobles stared at her in suspended, horrified fascination. From the inside, it felt like setting down a weight she hadn't known she was carrying until the moment her hands were free. The last thread gave way, and then the world came apart. The power didn't build, it arrived. All at once, from everywhere. From the deep place beneath where the bond had been, that ancient presence she had been sitting with for days, patient and enormous and utterly without limit. It rose through her like the tide, answering the moon, like something that had been waiting for exactly this moment, and found it, finally, after a very long time. Moonlight exploded through her, not metaphorically, not a sensation alone. The light was physical and visible, and it erupted from her skin like she had swallowed the moon whole, and it was simply too large to be contained, pouring from her palms, flooding from her chest, streaming upward through the vaulted ceiling windows and downward through the stone floor in silver rivers that moved like water but burned like starlight. The illusion spell shattered across the hall like glass hitting marble. She felt it break, felt every fragment of the council's magical construction dissolve simultaneously. 40 years of careful political spellwork collapsing in a single instant of genuine power, encountering constructed imitation. Like a painted flame meeting a real one, the constructed warmth was gone. What replaced it was not warm. It was vast. Her wolf rose without being called. She had never fully shifted in public. Omegas rarely did. There was little occasion and less invitation. Her wolf had always been present but quiet, a gentle secondary presence, soft-edged and unassuming. What rose through her now was neither gentle nor unassuming. It was silver-white, luminous, enormous in a way that had nothing to do with physical size, and everything to do with the kind of presence that made the air around it feel thin. Ancient was the only word for it. Pre-kingdom, pre-council, pre-everything that had been layered on top of what this land had once been. The wolf didn't snarl, didn't threaten. It simply stood, radiant and absolute, and let itself be seen. The council moved first. Lord Aldrich stepped back from the speaking platform, not retreating. He would probably never admit to retreating, but the distance between him and Cindy increased by several feet with remarkable speed. Councilman Devrin knocked his chair backward. 2 younger council members near the side wall pressed themselves flat against the stone like men trying to become part of the architecture. "Impossible," Aldrich said. The word came out stripped of its usual authority, reduced to something almost private. A man talking to himself. Jameson had not moved. He stood exactly where he had been standing, and he was staring at her not with the controlled, composed attention of the Alpha King, not with guilt or calculation or the careful management of public perception. He was staring at her the way people stared at things that fundamentally rearranged their understanding of the world. Raw, undone, unable to look away. Omegas can't, he started. They can. Her voice was completely calm, carrying the way voices carried when something larger than the speaker was behind them. You just never looked closely enough. The moonlight still moved around her, slower now, settling like something finding its natural level after a long disturbance. She felt the shift move through the room. Every alpha present, pack lords, nobles, soldiers standing at their ceremonial posts, she felt each of them register it at the same moment. That involuntary, instinctive recalibration that happened in wolves when genuine power announced itself. They all went quiet, not out of courtesy, out of something older than courtesy. Jameson looked at her across the silver light and understood, with a certainty that moved across his face like weather, that the woman standing in front of him was no longer the most vulnerable person in the room. She was the most powerful. Silverfang did not handle uncertainty quietly. By nightfall, the story had already fractured into competing versions, the way stories always fractured when they outpaced the people trying to control them. In the eastern barracks, soldiers spoke of the Luna's power in the hushed, careful tones reserved for things that rearranged what a person thought was possible. In the merchant quarters below the palace wall, the version circulating was louder, more embellished, already acquiring the particular drama that rumors collected like burrs when they traveled fast. In the noble houses, the conversation was quieter and considerably more dangerous. The council convened 3 times before midnight. Cindy knew, because she could feel the anxiety moving through the palace like a current through water. Lord Aldrich's cold contained fury, Devrin's calculating unease, the younger council members radiating something closer to genuine fear. She had always been able to feel the emotional weather of the palace. Now it was simply louder, as though the morning's events had tuned her sensitivity to a finer frequency. She sat in her chamber and let them panic. The fractures appeared by the second day. Pack Lord Edrin of the Stoneback territory sent formal word to the council, demanding Cindy's exile, the language diplomatic, but the intention as subtle as a blade laid flat on a table. An Omega-wielding lunar power of that magnitude was an instability, his letter reportedly argued, a threat to the natural hierarchy. Pack Lord Kalla of the Riverfen Pack sent a different kind of message. No formal letter, just her personal envoy, who appeared at Cindy's chamber door with a short handwritten note that said simply, "We stand with the moon's chosen, whatever comes next." Others said nothing publicly and waited, which was its own kind of statement. The Northern Claw Alliance, predictably, collapsed within hours. Princess Mara's representatives departed before the second sunrise, their convoy moving through the palace gates with the brisk, offended efficiency of people who had decided the situation was no longer worth their investment. Cindy watched them from her window without satisfaction and without grief. The council's careful architecture, 40 years of political construction, alliance management, controlled bonds and manufactured stability had come apart in a single morning, not because Cindy had intended to dismantle it, but because real things, when they finally moved, did not ask permission from constructed ones. Jameson came on the 3rd evening. She heard him in the corridor before he knocked his footsteps unmistakable, that particular deliberate weight and rhythm she had learned in 2 years of sharing adjacent space. She was standing at the window when the knock came. She considered not answering. Then she considered that avoidance was a form of fear, and she was finished being afraid of things in this palace. "Come in," she said. He looked like a man who hadn't slept. The composed, architectural perfection he maintained in public had worn thin around the edges, jaw unshaved, the shadows under his eyes deeper than usual, his formal jacket replaced by the plain dark shirt he wore when he thought no one was watching. He stood in the doorway for a moment as if confirming she was real and present, and exactly as formidable as she had been in the hall. Then he stepped inside and closed the door. "I've been trying to find the right words," he said. "Have you found them?" A long pause. "No." She turned from the window to face him fully. She felt, as she always felt with him now, the full complexity of what he was carrying. Guilt, layered over genuine grief, layered over something raw underneath both. Regret was too small a word for it. This was the feeling of a man confronting the specific gap between who he had believed himself to be and what his choices had revealed. She had some sympathy for that, not enough to protect him from it. "You wanted to tell me you're sorry," she said. "I am sorry. Immediate. Unqualified. Cindy, what the council did, what I allowed them to do. You didn't just allow it." Her voice was even, not cold. She had no interest in cruelty, had never had any interest in cruelty, even now, but clear, precisely, carefully clear. "You agreed to it. In that room, when Aldrich laid out the plan and Devrin explained my purpose, and you sat with the weight of the kingdom on your shoulders, you said yes. Not because you were forced, because you chose." His jaw tightened. He didn't argue. "You chose power over truth," she said. "And then you watched me deliver healing herbs and sit beside you at dinner and stand in that hall every day, and you said nothing. For weeks. I know. I'm not asking you to defend it. I'm telling you what it was." The silence stretched between them. Outside, the palace continued its fractured, anxious business. Inside this room there was only the two of them, and the truth, which was large and uncomfortable, and not going anywhere. When he finally spoke again, his voice had dropped to something private, something she suspected very few people had ever heard from him. "I loved you," he said. "Whatever the bond was made of, whatever the council built and intended, what I felt was real. I need you to know that." Cindy looked at him for a long moment. "I believe you," she said quietly. His shoulders released, slightly too soon. "But love isn't only what you feel," she continued. "It's also what you do, and what you did, when it cost you something to do right by me." She stopped, shook her head once. She moved to the wardrobe and opened it. Inside, a traveling pack sat already assembled. She had begun preparing it the morning after the haul. Jameson stared at it. Something moved through his face, the specific grief of watching a consequence arrive that no apology could redirect. "Where will you go?" Cindy lifted the pack and settled it across her shoulder. "Somewhere I can understand what I am," she said, "without this palace deciding it for me first." She walked toward the door, then paused, hand on the frame. She didn't look back, but she let her voice carry one final thing, not anger, not bitterness, something almost gentle. "Take care of the pack, Jameson. That part was always real too." Then she walked out, and the room behind her was very, very quiet. The road out of Silverfang was older than the kingdom. Cindy had known that in the abstract way you knew historical facts learned once, filed away, rarely examined. But walking it alone in the grey pre-dawn, her pack across her shoulder and the palace at her back, she felt it in a more immediate sense. The stones beneath her feet had been worn smooth by generations of travelers who had passed this way before anyone thought to call this territory a kingdom or draw lines around it and name what was inside. The road didn't belong to Silverfang. Silverfang had simply grown up around it. She walked for 3 hours before the palace disappeared entirely behind the tree line. She didn't look back. The ruins were not on any current map. She knew of them the way healers knew of old things, through the quiet, lateral transmission of knowledge that happened between people who paid attention to what others overlooked. The elder healer who raised her had mentioned them once, almost in passing, the way she mentioned things she considered foundational and obvious. The lunar stones north of the Ashfan boundary, older than the council, older than the pack system, older than the mate bond as anyone living understands it. Cindy had filed that away too. Now she walked toward it. The journey took 2 days. She moved through forest and open meadow, and a long stretch of elevated ridge where the wind came off the northern range, cold and direct, and she could see Silverfang's territory spread below her like a map of everything she was. Leaving, she felt the distance accumulating in her chest, not as loss exactly, but as a kind of clarification, each mile making something clearer that proximity had kept blurred. She had spent 2 years making herself small enough to fit inside someone else's story. She was finished with that. The ruins arrived the way significant things often arrived quietly, without announcement, simply present when she looked up. A circle of standing stones on a low hill above the tree line, older than anything she had vocabulary for. The stone itself was dark, almost black in overcast light, but in the thin afternoon sun that broke through the clouds as she climbed the hill, It caught the light differently, silvered, as if the moon had been baked into the material itself at some point before memory. She stepped inside the circle and stopped. The air was different here, not warmer or colder, simply more present. The particular quality of places where something real had happened repeatedly for a very long time, until the location itself held the residue of it. She set down her pack and sat in the center of the circle and waited. The understanding came gradually, not as a voice at first, but as a settling the deep, ancient presence she had first felt beneath the illusion bond, making itself fully known now that there was nothing constructed layered over it, like a signal clarifying when interference was removed. She sat with it through the afternoon and into the evening. Let it move through her the way she had learned to let things move through her without grabbing, without forcing, simply receiving. What she understood, piece by piece, was this. The true lunar gift had never been about strength in the way Silverfang measured strength. It was not dominance or physical power or the capacity for violence that pack hierarchy was built on. It was something older than hierarchy, the ability to receive the moon's energy directly to serve as a living conduit between lunar power and the world required one specific thing that could not be manufactured or trained or politically arranged: emotional clarity, not happiness, not the absence of pain. Clarity, the particular transparency that arrived when a person had been broken open honestly and had looked at every piece of what was inside without flinching and without denial, when there was no pretense left, no constructed story to maintain, nothing between the self and the truth. Pain, she understood now, had not damaged her into this power. It had cleaned her. Every week of quiet service while whispers followed her. Every meal where she had felt Jameson's conflict and said nothing. Every night she had sat by the window and watched the dark and told herself that what she felt was real and worth protecting. Every layer of herself she had offered to a bond that turned out to be constructed. All of it had required her to look directly at difficult things and continue anyway. That was what perfect emotional clarity meant. Not ease, courage. Meanwhile, behind her, Silverfang was coming apart at the seams. She didn't know the details. She was 2 days from the palace, beyond the range of normal pack communication. But she felt the distant unease the way she felt weather, low and persistent at the edge of awareness. Something large and unstable moving through the kingdom's emotional landscape. What she didn't know was that Pack Lord Edrin had moved beyond formal letters, that 2 minor packs had publicly withdrawn their allegiance to the throne, that the council, stripped of the political infrastructure it had spent decades constructing, was discovering that authority borrowed from manufactured stability was not the same as earned authority, and the difference was becoming painfully apparent. She didn't know that Jameson had spent 3 nights in the war room and emerged each morning looking like a man losing a battle he hadn't anticipated fighting, that he had twice picked up a pen to send word to her and twice set it down without writing anything. That Devrin had told him, with the particular cruelty of practical men, that his sentiment had cost them more than any enemy at the border. She didn't know any of it, but in the ruins, in the quiet, something told her the situation was urgent in the way that earthquakes were urgent, not fast, but fundamental. The lunar spirit arrived just before dawn, not dramatically, not in fire or sound or the theatrical presentation of things trying to announce their own importance, simply present, the way the old things in this circle were present, as if it had always been there and she had only just become capable of perceiving it. It was light, primarily, silver-white, moving like water, but standing upright, holding a shape that suggested form without fully committing to one, ancient in a way that made Cindy's earlier sense of the ruins' age feel approximate and humble. She sat very still. The presence regarded her with something that was not quite attention, but the closest thing to attention that something that large and old could offer something as small and brief as a single wolf. When it spoke, the words arrived inside her chest rather than through her ears. You were never meant to be lunar. She had expected something like this, had perhaps known it, in the unexamined way you knew things you weren't ready to look at directly. The presence continued. You were meant to be something greater. The silver light expanded slowly outward across the circle, across the dark stones, up into the pale pre-dawn sky, patient and vast, and completely without urgency, the way things moved when they operated outside of time. Cindy sat inside it and let herself be seen, fully, completely, without the constructed warmth of a borrowed bond or the careful smallness of 2 years spent fitting herself into a role built for someone else, just herself. And for the first time, in a very long time, that felt like enough. It felt like more than enough. It felt like the beginning of something. She felt it before she heard it. 3 days into her time at the ruins, in the grey hour before sunrise, when the lunar presence was strongest and her awareness had learned to extend outward like a second skin, she felt it. A violent rupture in Silverfang's emotional landscape. Not the slow, grinding unease of political instability she had been sensing at the edges of her awareness. Something faster, sharper. The specific feeling of a decision made with weapons. She was already moving before she had consciously chosen to. She arrived at Silverfang's eastern boundary by nightfall. The signs were visible from a distance torch columns against the dark sky, the kind that meant military assembly rather than ceremony. The sound of wolves moving in numbers, the low tactical communication of a pack preparing for violence. She crested the ridge above the valley and saw it spread below her. Pack Lord Edrin had not stopped at formal letters. His forces had assembled at the valley floor, 3 packs combined, she estimated, reading the banner configurations from the ridge. Enough to challenge the throne directly, enough to have calculated that Silverfang, destabilized by the council's collapse and stripped of its northern alliance, would struggle to hold. He had calculated correctly about most things. He had not calculated for her. She came down from the ridge, the way the moon came over the horizon, without hurry, without announcement, simply inevitable. The lunar energy moved with her differently now than it had in the hall. In the hall it had erupted, surprised into expression, raw and uncontrolled. 3 days in the ruins had changed that. She understood it now the way she understood her own breathing, a natural rhythm, responsive and precise, hers to direct. She walked through the valley, toward the assembled forces, and let the light come. It spread from her steadily outward across the frozen ground, silver-white, turning the dark valley luminous. Not aggressive, not threatening in the way of weapons or dominance displays. Something more fundamental than aggression. The moonlight reached the edges of Edrin's assembled packs, and the wolves there went quiet, not silenced by force, but stilled by something their instincts recognized before their minds did. The same thing that happened in the hall. That involuntary, species-deep response to genuine power. Edrin himself was mounted on the valley floor, armored, his command position carefully chosen. She watched him register her arrival, watched the calculation in his face as he tried to categorize what he was seeing, and found that none of his existing categories fit. "Stand down," she said. Her voice carried across the valley without effort, the lunar energy lending it a resonance that had nothing to do with volume. Edrin's horse shifted beneath him. "You have no authority here, Omega," he said, loudly, for his assembled forces as much as for her. "You are not Luna. You hold no title. You command no." The moonlight intensified, not in anger. In clarity, the same clarity she had found in the ruins, the same transparency that came from having nothing left to protect, except the truth. She let the full weight of what she was make itself felt across the valley. Not a performance, not a threat. Simply, completely present. Edrin's horse reared. Half his front line took a step backward before anyone ordered them to. "Stand down," she said again, quietly. They stood down. Jameson found her at the valley's edge an hour later, after his own forces had moved in to manage the formal surrender, and Edran's banners had been lowered into the frost. He came without escort, without his formal blacks, without the architectural composure he wore for public occasions. Just the man. He stood in front of her, in the silver-lit dark, and looked at her, the way he had looked at her in the hall, with that raw, unguarded quality that stripped everything constructed away. Except this time there was no guilt underneath it. Or rather, the guilt was still there, but it had settled into something older and quieter. The specific humility of a person who had seen themselves clearly and accepted what they found. "You didn't have to come back," he said. "I know. But you did. This is still my home, she said simply. Whatever else it is. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Cindy, I am sorry. Not for what it costs me to say it, or what I'm hoping you'll do with it. Just, I am sorry. For all of it. She looked at him, felt the truth of it moving through him, clean and unqualified. I know, she said again, softer this time. His eyes moved across her face, asking a question he was choosing not to put into words, because he already understood the answer. The bond is gone, she said gently, and I won't rebuild what was already broken before we knew it was constructed. That's not what comes next. Not for me. Something moved through his expression. Grief, real and unperformed. The loss of something he understood now, too late. He had never properly valued while he had it. He nodded once. Then what does come next? He asked. For you. Cindy looked out across the valley, the silver light still resting on the frost, the quieted forces, the ancient ridgeline beyond, the dark sky above it all holding its patient, enormous presence. I stay, she said, not as your Luna, not as the council's symbol or anyone's placeholder, or a title that belongs to someone else's story. She turned back to him. I stay is what I am. The council formalized it 3 days later, with significantly less dignity than they would have preferred. They had little choice. 2 packs had already pledged directly to her, not to the throne, not to the Alpha King's authority, but to her specifically. The lunar stones outside the palace had begun glowing faintly at night, visible from the upper ramparts, a detail that moved through Silverfang's population, with the speed and weight of the kind of sign people had been raised to recognize. Even Aldrich, whatever he privately thought, understood that the political architecture of the kingdom had fundamentally changed, and that surviving the change required acknowledging what had changed it. The title they gave her had not been used in centuries. Lunar Guardian of Silverfang, answerable to no council, bound to no alpha, positioned outside the hierarchy that had defined every wolf in the kingdom since its founding. Not above it, exactly, but adjacent to it. A different kind of authority entirely, the kind that didn't need enforcement because it was simply, undeniably real. She kept the chamber with the narrow window, the one where she had watched the dark sky soften every morning for 2 years, learning to feel the moon's presence lingering at the edge of dawn. She still rose before sunrise, still sat with her knees pulled to her chest, watching the moment darkness gave way to light. But she didn't sit alone anymore, not in the way she had before. That careful, private solitude of someone making themselves small. She sat in the full knowledge of what she was, and the moonlight came through the glass, the way it had been coming to her since long before she had any name for what it meant. Patient, certain, returning every morning regardless of what the night before had held. The kingdom had believed, for as long as anyone could remember, that Omegas were the weakest wolves alive. They had built their entire hierarchy around that belief, had arranged their politics and their alliances and their carefully constructed bonds on the foundation of it. But they had forgotten something important. The moon does not measure strength the way kingdoms do. It does not choose the loudest wolf, or the most powerful bloodline, or the one with the most political allies and the most carefully managed image. It chooses the one who can be broken open completely and still look up, the one brave enough to stand in the middle of everything constructed and false and borrowed and say, "This is not real, and I will not pretend otherwise." The one willing to break the bond first. Sometimes the wolf the moon truly chose was never the one anyone expected. Sometimes she was the one they had already decided didn't matter. And sometimes she was the one who saved the kingdom they had tried to use her to protect. If Cindy's story surprised you, let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where the wolves everyone underestimated turn out to be the ones the moon chose all along.